Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, Midnight Nightmares. Today I'll be reading 3 true horror stories about the first night in a new house. So, sit back, grab a drink, and a snack of your choice and relax. Let's get into the video. Story 1. Whispers in the Shadows. I never believed in ghosts or haunted houses. That was kid stuff. Movies and campfire stories. So, when I got the keys to my new house, an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, I was excited. Sure, it needed work, but it had character. The kind of place where I could see myself starting over. The first thing I noticed was the creak in the stairs. Not unusual for an old house. But these creaked in a way that made you think someone was behind you, mimicking your steps. I shrugged it off as settling wood. I had been doing that a lot lately, shrugging things off. It had become a habit, like a defense mechanism for all the other unsettling stuff in my life. Moving in by myself was a nightmare. I didn't own much, but still, lugging boxes up those narrow stairs was a pain. By the time the last box was in, the sun had set, and the house was bathed in shadows. No big deal. I'd bought a couple of lamps and figured I'd be fine with those until I could get more light fixtures up. I ordered a pizza, cracked open a beer, and decided to take a break. The living room had a big bay window that overlooked the overgrown garden. So I settled in there, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were too long, too sharp, as if they were more than just a lack of light. Then the noises started. At first, it was just a soft rustling, like leaves in the wind. But there was no wind. The air was still heavy. It felt like the house was holding its breath. I chalked it up to the old roof and went back to my pizza, ignoring the chill crawling up my spine. I was halfway through the pizza when the footsteps began. Slow, deliberate. Not my footsteps. I stopped chewing, listening intently. The sound was coming from upstairs, directly above me. My bedroom. I remember thinking, no way. I knew I was alone. The door was locked, and the only set of keys was in my pocket. My heart was racing, pounding in my chest so loudly I was sure it would drown out the sound. But it didn't. The footsteps were clear, moving from one end of the room to the other, then stopping, as if someone was standing still, listening. I swallowed the bite of pizza that had gone cold in my mouth, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. I was a logical person. I didn't believe in the supernatural, so I told myself it was just the house. Maybe it was the old pipes or the wooden floorboards settling. But deep down, I knew better. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, which happened to be a half-empty beer bottle, and started up the stairs. The closer I got to the top, the louder the footsteps became. They were slow, methodical, and heavy. They stopped just as I reached the top of the stairs, the hallway plunging into an unnerving silence. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to leave the house. But I forced myself to move forward. The door to the bedroom was ajar, and I could see the flicker of shadows moving inside. My breath hitched. I hadn't left any lights on in there. I pushed the door open, bottle raised, ready to swing at whatever or whoever I found. But the room was empty. The shadows were just that. Shadows, playing tricks on my mind. My bed was still unmade, boxes still stacked against the walls. But the air was thick with something I couldn't describe. Fear? Dread? I wasn't sure, but it was suffocating. I lowered the bottle, laughing at myself for being so jumpy. The tension eased, and I was about to turn and leave when I heard it again. A soft, low whisper, right behind me. My body froze, a cold shiver running down my spine. I didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. My heart slammed in my chest as I spun around, but there was no one there. Just empty space, taunting me. I backed out of the room, almost tripping over my own feet in my haste to get to the hallway. As I did, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the door. My rational mind was fighting to take control, to explain away what had just happened. But how do you explain a door slamming itself shut? How do you explain whispers in an empty room? I forced myself to breathe, to think. Maybe it was a draft. Maybe the old house wasn't as sturdy as I thought. Maybe. But I knew I was lying to myself. There was no draft. The windows were shut tight. The air still. I couldn't stay in the house. Not that night. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted down the stairs, not caring that I left the lights on, the door unlocked. I just needed to get out. I drove aimlessly, not sure where I was going, just needing to be away from that house. I ended up in a 24-hour diner, the kind with bad coffee and worse food. But I didn't care. It was bright, and there were people. Safe. I stayed there until the sun started to rise, sipping on coffee that tasted like burnt dirt, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. That I was just stressed from the move. That I'd imagined the whole thing. When I finally went back, the house looked different in the daylight. Less menacing. The shadows were gone. And everything was as I'd left it, except for one thing. The bedroom door was wide open. I know I didn't leave it like that. The slam had echoed through the house, and I'd heard it click shut. But now, it stood open, like an invitation, or a warning. I walked through the house in a daze, trying to ignore the pounding in my chest. Everything was normal, as if the events of the night had been nothing but a bad dream. But as I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the dusty floorboards, were footprints. Not mine. These were smaller, like a child's, leading from the window to the bed. And right next to them was a single tiny handprint, pressed into the dust, almost like a signature. I haven't slept in that house since. Story 2. The room at the end of the hall. I should have listened to the old man who sold me the house. He looked at me with this strange, serious expression and said, "The room at the end of the hall, don't go in there at night." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to mess with me. Or maybe it was one of those local legends meant to keep outsiders on edge. But now, sitting here in the dark, I wish I'd taken him seriously. The house was a steal, no doubt about that. A 3-bedroom farmhouse, way out in the country, for the price of a crappy apartment in the city. I didn't think twice. The place had charm. A big wraparound porch, an old barn out back, and trees as far as you could see. Perfect for a fresh start. The first day was exhausting. Moving is always a hassle, but moving by yourself to a place where the nearest neighbor is a mile away, that's a whole new level of tiring. By the time I got everything inside, it was already getting dark. I decided to leave the unpacking for tomorrow and just focus on getting my bed set up. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I'm used to the noise of the city, cars, people, the constant hum of life. Out here, the silence was heavy, pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sounded unnervingly loud. I was heading down the hall to the bedroom when I remembered the old man's warning. The room at the end of the hall. I hadn't even opened that door yet, mostly because I figured it was just another empty room. Curiosity got the better of me, though. I figured I'd take a quick peek, just to prove to myself there was nothing to worry about. The door was old, the kind with the crystal doorknob that looks like it belongs in a different century. When I turned it, the knob was cold. Almost too cold for a warm summer night. The door creaked open, and I found myself staring into a room that felt wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Wrong. The room was empty, except for a single wooden rocking chair in the middle. The walls were bare, no windows, just this oppressive darkness that seemed to seep out from the corners. The air inside was stale, like the room hadn't been opened in years, and it was freezing, much colder than the rest of the house. I stood there, feeling like I was intruding on something I didn't understand. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a shiver ran down my spine. I was about to step inside when I felt this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, like something was pushing me back, telling me to stay out. So, I did. I closed the door, locking it without really thinking, and went back to my room. I figured it was just the fatigue playing tricks on me, making me feel weird about an empty room. I pushed it out of my mind, brushed my teeth, and got into bed, determined to get some sleep. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just a faint creaking, like someone walking on old floorboards. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was the house settling, but it didn't stop. The creaking turned into footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hall towards my room. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But then, the footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, anything. But there was just silence, thick, suffocating silence. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, clutching the covers like they could somehow protect me. And then the door handle turned. It was slow, deliberate, like someone on the other side was testing it, making sure I was awake, making sure I knew they were there. The handle rattled and my stomach dropped. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so intense it felt like I was drowning. The door creaked open just a crack, and the air in the room grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. A presence. Something watching me from the other side of the door. Then I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper, like someone standing inches from my ear, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The voice was low, raspy, and filled with something that made my blood run cold. The door closed as slowly as it had opened, and the footsteps retreated back down the hall. I stayed awake the entire night, every nerve on edge, listening to the silence, waiting for whatever it was to come back. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the curtains, I jumped out of bed and ran down the hall. The door to the room at the end was wide open, but this time the rocking chair wasn't in the middle of the room. It was right at the door, facing the hall, as if someone had been sitting there, watching my door all night. I left the house that morning. I didn't take anything with me, just grabbed my keys and drove until I reached the nearest motel. I haven't gone back since. Whatever was in that house, it wanted to keep me there, to make sure I didn't leave. I called the old man a few days later, asked him what the hell was going on with that house. He just sighed, said something about it being built on old land, cursed land, and that the room at the end of the hall had always been trouble. He didn't know what was in there, and he didn't want to know. That's why he sold the place. I don't believe in ghosts, or curses, or any of that. At least I didn't. But there's something in that house. Something that doesn't want to be disturbed. And I'm not going back to find out what it is. My advice? If someone tells you not to go into a room, don't go into the damn room. Story 3. The crying in the walls. Moving into a new house is supposed to be exciting, right? A fresh start, a new chapter, all that stuff. But the minute I stepped foot in the place, something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. Just a heavy feeling, like the air was thicker than it should be. But I ignored it. I had to. I'd sunk every penny into this house, and there was no turning back now. The place was old, probably over 100 years, with creaky floors and drafty windows. It had character, as the realtor put it. I didn't mind. I liked the idea of living in a house with history, a place that had seen generations come and go. What I didn't realize was how much of that history might still be lingering. The first day was the usual chaos of moving. Boxes everywhere, trying to figure out where everything goes, finding out the fridge didn't work. I was too busy to notice anything weird. But that night, when everything quieted down, that's when I first heard it. It was this soft, muffled sound like someone crying. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a neighbor or something. But it was too faint, too close. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sound didn't stop. It was this low, pitiful sobbing, like a child crying in the dark. And it was constant, just on the edge of hearing, like it wanted to be noticed but didn't want to be found. I wandered around the house, pressing my ear to the walls, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to move, always just out of reach, always fading when I got too close. My nerves were shot. I was exhausted, but there was no way I could sleep with that sound echoing in my head. Around midnight, I finally found it. The crying was loudest in the hallway, right outside the door to the small bedroom I'd planned to turn into a home office. The sobbing was clearer now, more distinct, and definitely coming from inside the walls. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it had to be something explainable. Pipes, wind, something logical. I pressed my hand against the wall, and that's when I felt it. The wall was vibrating ever so slightly, like something was moving inside. The crying grew louder, more desperate, like whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew I was there, knew I could hear them. I yanked my hand back, cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. I felt like I was losing my mind. There was no way this was real. It couldn't be. But the crying didn't stop. It just kept going, filling the silence of the house with this overwhelming sadness that made my chest ache. I was done. I needed to know what the hell was going on. So, I grabbed a hammer from one of the boxes and went back to the hallway. The crying was so loud now. It was like it was coming from right behind the wall. Without thinking, I swung the hammer, punching a hole straight through the plaster. The crying stopped. Just like that, it was dead silent. I stood there breathing hard, staring at the hole in the wall. The air around me felt thick, like it was pressing in on me, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I peered into the hole, expecting to see, I don't know, something, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the faint smell of damp wood. I reached into the hole, my fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. I pulled it out slowly, my heart racing. It was an old key, rusty and worn, the kind you'd expect to see in some horror movie. I had no idea what it opened, but just holding it made my skin crawl. And then the crying started again. Only this time, it wasn't in the walls. It was coming from the room behind me, the small bedroom. The door was closed, but I could hear the sobbing clear as day, like someone was standing right on the other side. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the key. I didn't want to open that door. Every instinct was screaming at me to leave, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't just leave it. I had to know. So I forced myself to move, step by step, until I was standing in front of the door. I could hear the crying so clearly now, so raw and full of pain that it made my throat tighten. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the crying didn't stop. It was all around me, echoing off the walls, filling the space with this unbearable sadness. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was nothing there, no one there, but the sound was real. It was right there, and then I saw it. The closet door. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness spilling out into the room. The crying was coming from inside. I wanted to run. I should have run. But instead, I walked towards the closet, my heart hammering in my chest. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and for a split second, I hesitated. But I had to know. I yanked the door open. The crying stopped. The closet was empty, just a small dark space with nothing but dust and old hangers. But the air inside was freezing, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. And then I saw it. Scratches on the inside of the door, deep, jagged marks, like someone had been clawing to get out. I stumbled back, dropping the key. My stomach churned, and I could barely breathe. I didn't wait to find out more. I bolted out of the room, out of the house, and didn't stop running until I was in my car, keys shaking in my hand as I fumbled to start the engine. I drove to a hotel that night, and I haven't gone back since. I don't know what's in that house, what's trapped behind those walls. But I'm not sticking around to find out. The house can keep its secrets, its crying ghosts, and its rusty old key. Whatever it is, it's not something I want to mess with. And if you ever hear crying in the walls, don't go looking for it. Just leave. Trust me.